Sarah Martinez pressed her eye against the scope, her breathing steady despite the weight of doubt crushing her chest. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training range, and she could feel dozens of eyes watching her every move. At 23, she was the only woman in this elite marksman training program, and everyone seemed to be waiting for her to fail. "Take your time, Martinez," called Sergeant Williams from behind the firing line. His voice carried that familiar tone she had grown to hate, patient but condescending, like he was humoring a child who insisted on playing with the grown-ups. Sarah's fingers tightened around her standard-issue rifle. She had been using the same weapon for 3 months now, and, while her scores were decent, they weren't exceptional. In a program where exceptional was the minimum requirement, decent meant you were already packing your bags. The target stood 200 meters away, a black silhouette against the desert backdrop. She had hit targets at this distance countless times before, but today felt different. Today, the whispers behind her seemed louder, the skeptical glances more pointed. She was scheduled to rotate to a new practice station after this round, just another routine drill in what had become a series of routine disappointments. Sarah pulled the trigger. The shot rang out across the range, echoing off the distant hills. Through her scope, she watched the bullet strike the target's outer ring. Not terrible, but not impressive either. Just adequate. "Nice shot, Martinez," Sergeant Williams said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Wilson, you're up next." Marcus Wilson stepped forward, a cocky grin plastered across his face. He was the golden boy of their training class, 6 feet tall, broad shoulders, and a shooting record that made instructors nod with approval. He settled into position with practiced ease, and Sarah knew his shot would find the bullseye. It always did. As she prepared to move to the next station, Sarah noticed commotion near the instructor's booth. 3 men in desert camouflage approached, their bearing unmistakably different from the regular training staff. Even from a distance, she could see the quiet confidence in their movements, the way other soldiers instinctively made space for them. Navy SEALs. Sarah had heard rumors that special operations personnel sometimes visited the training facilities, but she had never seen them before. The lead SEAL was tall and lean, with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His name tape read Davidson, and when he spoke with Sergeant Williams, his voice was low and measured. "We're observing today's training," Davidson said, though it sounded more like a statement than a request. "Don't mind us." The other 2 SEALs spread out along the firing line, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere. Sarah noticed how the other trainees straightened their postures, how their usual chatter died down to respectful whispers. These weren't just soldiers, they were legends walking among mortals. Wilson's shot cracked across the range, and Sarah didn't need binoculars to know it had found its mark. The instructors nodded approvingly, and Wilson stood with the satisfaction of someone who had never doubted the outcome. "Outstanding work, Wilson," Sergeant Williams called out. "That's how it's done." Sarah collected her gear and began walking toward the pistol range, the next station in her rotation. As she passed near the SEALs, she kept her eyes forward, not wanting to seem like she was gawking. But, as she drew closer, she heard Davidson's quiet voice. "The woman," he said to one of his teammates. "What's her story?" Sarah's step faltered slightly, but she forced herself to keep walking. She couldn't hear the response, but she felt heat rise in her cheeks. Even the elite special operations community had noticed her, probably wondering what she was doing here, questioning whether the standards had been lowered to accommodate her presence. At the pistol range, Sarah tried to focus on the fundamentals her instructors had drilled into her. Stance, grip, sight alignment, trigger control. But her mind kept drifting to those quiet words, "the woman." Not that soldier or Martinez, just her gender, as if that explained everything anyone needed to know about her capabilities. She fired 6 rounds at the 15-meter target, each shot methodical and controlled. The grouping was tight, not exceptional, but solid. Competent. That word had become the soundtrack of her military career. Competent enough to stay, not skilled enough to excel. Martinez. Sarah turned to find Sergeant Williams approaching with Davidson in tow. Her stomach clenched with anticipation. Had she done something wrong? Was this where they finally told her that competent wasn't enough? "Chief Petty Officer Davidson wanted to observe your shooting," Williams explained, though his expression suggested he found the request puzzling. Davidson stepped forward, extending his hand. "Chief Davidson," he said simply. "Mind if I watch you work?" Sarah shook his hand, surprised by the straightforward introduction. Most officers, especially senior ones, expected her to initiate the military courtesies. Davidson's handshake was firm but not aggressive, and his eyes held no trace of the condescension she had grown accustomed to. "Of course, Chief," she replied. "Though I should warn you, I'm nothing special." Something flickered across Davidson's expression, not pity, but something harder to define. "I'll be the judge of that," he said. Sarah returned to the firing line, acutely aware of the SEAL's presence behind her. She could feel other trainees stealing glances in her direction, probably wondering what had attracted Special Operations' attention to the program's weakest link. She raised her pistol, focused on the target, and fired. The shot struck center mass, a solid hit. She fired again, another good shot. By the sixth round, she had managed a respectable grouping that any instructor would approve of. "Reload," Davidson said quietly. Sarah changed magazines and settled back into her stance. This time, she was conscious of Davidson moving closer, though he remained far enough back not to interfere. She fired another 6 rounds, her breathing steady despite the scrutiny. "Again," Davidson said. They repeated the drill 3 more times. Each round, Sarah's shots found their mark, though none of her groupings would win any competitions. She was consistent, reliable, but not extraordinary. The story of her life in uniform. When she finally lowered her weapon, Davidson stepped up beside her. For a long moment, he studied the target through his own binoculars, saying nothing. Sarah waited, unsure whether she should speak or remain silent. "You're holding back," he said finally. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Sir?" Davidson turned to face her, and she was surprised to see no judgment in his expression. "You shoot like someone who's afraid to miss. Every shot is calculated, controlled, safe. You're not shooting to excel, you're shooting not to fail." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "I'm trying to meet the standards, Chief." "The standards," Davidson repeated, and there was something almost sad in his voice. "You know what I see when I watch you shoot, Martinez?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I see someone with natural ability who's been convinced she doesn't belong here. You've got steady hands, good instincts, and better situational awareness than half the cowboys I've worked with. But you're so busy trying to prove you deserve to be here that you're not showing what you're actually capable of." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah had heard plenty of feedback during her training, most of it focused on technical improvements or effort level. No one had ever talked about what she was capable of, only what she was failing to achieve. "I don't understand, Chief," she said quietly. Davidson glanced around the range, taking in the other trainees who were trying to pretend they weren't eavesdropping. "You want to know what separates good shooters from great ones? It's not just skill, it's confidence. The willingness to trust your abilities and take the shot that matters." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Tomorrow, I'm running a special training exercise. Small group, high-pressure scenarios. I could use someone with your perspective." Sarah's heart began to race. "You want me to join your training?" "If you're interested," Davidson said. "Fair warning though, it won't be like anything you've done here. No safety nets, no second chances. You'll be working with operators who've been doing this longer than you've been alive, and they won't care about your feelings." The offer was both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah had dreamed of opportunities like this, but she had never imagined they would come from someone like Davidson. She thought about all the whispers, all the doubts, all the times she had settled for adequate when she wanted to be exceptional. "What would I need to do?" she asked. Davidson smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Show up ready to learn." "And, Martinez?" He paused until she met his eyes. "Leave the safe shooting behind. Tomorrow, we find out what you're really made of." As Davidson walked away, Sarah remained at the firing line, his words echoing in her mind. For 3 months, she had been trying to prove she belonged. Tomorrow, someone was giving her the chance to discover who she could become. She looked down at her pistol, then back at the target. 6 shots, center mass, perfectly adequate. She raised the weapon one more time, took aim, and fired. This shot struck dead center, better than any she had fired all day. Maybe Davidson was right. Maybe she had been shooting not to fail instead of shooting to succeed. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would find out what happened when Sarah Martinez stopped holding back and started believing she deserved to be here. The sun was beginning to set over the training facility, casting everything in golden light. Sarah secured her weapon and gathered her gear, her mind already racing ahead to whatever challenge Davidson had in store. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but, for the first time since arriving at the program, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Sarah arrived at the designated meeting point 30 minutes early, her gear bag slung over her shoulder and her mind racing with possibilities. The location Davidson had given her was different from the usual training areas, a smaller, more isolated section of the base that she had never seen before. The morning air was crisp, and she could hear the distant sounds of regular training exercises echoing across the desert. At exactly 0600, Davidson emerged from a small building she hadn't noticed before. He was followed by two other men she didn't recognize, both clearly special operations, based on their confident bearing and the way they moved with practiced efficiency. Martinez, Davidson nodded. Glad you came. Meet Staff Sergeant Torres and Petty Officer Chen. Torres was built like a linebacker, with kind eyes that contrasted sharply with his intimidating physique. Chen was smaller but moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting his craft. Both men assessed Sarah with professional interest rather than skepticism, which was more respect than she usually received. "Ma'am," Torres said with a slight nod. Chen simply raised his hand in acknowledgement. "Today's exercise is different from what you're used to," Davidson explained as he led them toward a series of buildings that Sarah now realized were designed to simulate urban combat environments. "We're not shooting at paper targets or measuring groupings. We're going to put you in scenarios where the shooting is just one part of a larger problem." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with nervous energy. "What kind of scenarios?" "Hostage situations," Chen answered. "Close quarters, multiple threats, civilian considerations. The kind of shooting where hesitation gets people killed, but recklessness gets them killed too." They stopped in front of a building that looked like it could have been lifted from any city street, complete with windows, doorways, and realistic interior layouts. Sarah could see movement inside, though she couldn't make out details from her position. "Before we begin," Davidson said, turning to face her directly, "I need you to understand something. What happens here stays here. This isn't an official training program, and it's not part of your regular curriculum. Consider it professional development." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. Torres stepped forward, holding a different rifle than the standard training weapon Sarah was familiar with. "You'll be using this today," he said, offering her the weapon. "It's what we use operationally. Lighter, more responsive, better optics." Sarah accepted the rifle, immediately noticing the difference in weight and balance. The weapon felt almost alive in her hands, purpose-built for precision rather than mass production. The scope was clearer than anything she had used before, and the trigger had a crispness that her training weapons lacked. "Take a few minutes to familiarize yourself," Davidson instructed. "Torres will walk you through the differences." For the next 20 minutes, Torres patiently explained the weapon's capabilities while Sarah practiced with the new rifle. The difference was remarkable. Every aspect of the weapon seemed designed to enhance rather than limit her abilities. She found herself hitting targets she would have struggled with using her standard equipment. "Better?" Davidson asked as she finished her practice rounds. "Much better," Sarah admitted. "I didn't realize how much the equipment was limiting me." Chen laughed, but not unkindly. "Welcome to the difference between training gear and operational gear. One is built to survive abuse by thousands of students. The other is built to save lives when it matters." Davidson gestured toward the building. "Ready for the real test?" Sarah's heart began to race, but she nodded. They approached the structure, and she could now see that the interior was populated with both targets and mannequins dressed to look like civilians. The scenario was more complex than anything she had encountered in her regular training. "Here's the situation," Davidson explained. 3 armed hostiles have taken control of this building. For civilians inside, locations unknown. Your job is to neutralize the threats while ensuring the safety of the innocents. Questions? Sarah studied the building layout, noting the multiple entry points and windows. Rules of engagement? Hostiles are armed and dangerous. Civilians are not. Don't shoot the wrong people, Torres said bluntly. And, Sarah? She turned to look at him. This isn't a training exercise where you get to restart if you mess up. In our world, mistakes have consequences. Treat this accordingly. The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket. This wasn't about hitting bullseyes or impressing instructors. This was about life and death decisions, split-second judgments that could mean the difference between saving lives and causing tragedy. Davidson handed her an earpiece. We'll be observing and providing guidance if necessary, but the decisions are yours. Trust your instincts, trust your training, and trust the weapon in your hands. Sarah inserted the earpiece and approached the building's main entrance. Through the windows, she could see shapes moving inside, some clearly armed figures, others that appeared to be civilians. The complexity of the scenario was overwhelming compared to the simple target practice she was used to. She took a deep breath and pushed through the front door. The interior was dimly lit, with multiple rooms branching off from a central hallway. Sarah moved cautiously, the new rifle feeling natural in her hands despite her racing pulse. She could hear voices coming from one of the side rooms, harsh, commanding tones that suggested the hostiles were actively controlling their captives. As she approached the first doorway, Sarah caught sight of movement in her peripheral vision. She spun, rifle ready, and found herself face-to-face with a civilian mannequin positioned to look like it was running toward the exit. Her finger was on the trigger, but something made her pause. Good instinct, Davidson's voice came through the earpiece. Civilians don't always behave predictably in crisis situations. The ones running toward you aren't always running from the bad guys. Sarah continued through the building, her awareness heightened to levels she had never experienced before. Every shadow could hide a threat, every sound could signal danger or an innocent person in distress. The traditional training that had emphasized controlled, deliberate shooting seemed inadequate for this environment where decisions had to be made in milliseconds. She reached the room where the voices were coming from and carefully peered around the corner. The scene inside was complex, two armed figures standing over what appeared to be three civilians who were seated on the floor. But the positioning was wrong somehow, the angles wouldn't allow for clean shots without risking the hostages. What do you see? Chen's voice in her earpiece. 2 tangos, 3 civilians. No clean shot from this angle, Sarah whispered. So what's your next move? Sarah studied the room layout, noting a window on the far side that might provide a better vantage point. Reposition. Need a different angle. Good thinking. But, remember, time matters in these situations. The longer you wait, the more opportunity the hostiles have to harm the civilians. The pressure was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in training. She made her way around the building exterior, using the window to get a clearer view of the situation inside. From this new position, she could see that one of the armed figures was positioned where she could take a clean shot without endangering the civilians. Sarah settled into a shooting position, controlling her breathing as she had been taught. But, as she looked through the scope, she realized this was nothing like shooting at paper targets. The hostile was moving, the lighting was poor, and the stakes were real in a way that practice could never simulate. She took the shot. The target dropped immediately, and Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction that was quickly replaced by renewed focus. One threat down, but the situation was still dangerous. The second hostile had reacted to the gunshot and was now using the civilians as cover, making a clean shot impossible. Nice work on the first target, Torres's voice. Now what? Sarah watched through the scope as the remaining hostile grew increasingly agitated. The simulation was sophisticated enough that the target actually appeared to be threatening the civilian mannequins in response to her actions. She needed to end this quickly, but safely. She noticed that the hostile had positioned himself near a wall where the angles might work in her favor. If she could get him to move just slightly. Sarah fired a shot that deliberately missed, striking the wall near the hostile's position. As she had hoped, the target moved away from the wall, giving her the clear shot she needed. Her second shot found its mark. Target down, she reported, though her voice was shaky with adrenaline. Outstanding work, Davidson's voice came through the earpiece, and Sarah could hear genuine approval in his tone. Come on out, let's debrief. Sarah made her way back outside, her legs feeling slightly unsteady. The entire exercise had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. The difference between this kind of shooting and her regular training was profound, not just in the equipment or the scenarios, but in the mental demands. Davidson, Torres, and Chen were waiting for her outside the building, all wearing expressions of professional assessment. "How did that feel?" Davidson asked. "Intense," Sarah replied honestly. "Completely different from anything I've done before." "Different how?" Chun prompted. Sarah thought for a moment, trying to articulate the experience. "In regular training, the shooting is the whole point. Here, the shooting was just a tool to solve a larger problem. I had to think about timing, positioning, consequences. The technical aspects of marksmanship were almost secondary." Torres nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. Most people get so focused on the mechanics of shooting that they forget to think about why they're shooting." "Your shot placement was solid," Davidson added. "But, more importantly, your decision-making was sound. You took time to assess the situation, you repositioned when necessary, and you found creative solutions when the obvious approach wasn't available." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the desert sun. For the first time since beginning her training, someone was praising her decision-making rather than just her technical execution. "There's more," Chen said. This was just the first scenario. Over the next 3 hours, Sarah worked through increasingly complex situations. She cleared buildings with multiple floors, engaged targets at varying distances, and made split-second decisions about civilian safety. Each scenario pushed her further outside her comfort zone, demanding skills she hadn't even known she possessed. The specialized equipment made a tremendous difference, but Sarah began to realize that the real limitation had never been her gear, it had been her own expectations. For months, she had been shooting to avoid failure rather than striving for excellence. Under Davidson's guidance, she found herself taking calculated risks, trusting her instincts, and performing at levels she had never imagined possible. "Last scenario," Davidson announced as the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows. "This one's different. No guidance from us, no second chances. You make the calls, you live with the consequences." Sarah nodded, though her stomach clenched with nervous energy. She had grown comfortable with the team's guidance throughout the day, and the thought of operating completely independently was both thrilling and terrifying. As she approached the final building, Sarah realized that everything had changed since that morning. She no longer felt like someone trying to prove she belonged, she felt like someone discovering what she was capable of accomplishing. The weapon in her hands felt like an extension of her own body, and her mind was clear and focused in a way that months of traditional training had never achieved. Whatever waited inside that building, Sarah Martinez was ready to face it. For the first time in her military career, she wasn't shooting to avoid failure. She was shooting to succeed. Sarah stood before the final building, her pulse steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. The structure was larger than the previous training sites, with multiple levels and what appeared to be a complex interior layout. Unlike the earlier scenarios where Davidson and his team had provided guidance, this time she would be completely on her own. "Remember," Davidson said as he handed her additional ammunition, "this scenario is designed to test everything you've learned today. Technical skills, tactical thinking, decision-making under pressure. Most importantly, it will test whether you trust yourself enough to succeed." Sarah checked her equipment one final time, ensuring everything was secured and accessible. The rifle that had felt foreign that morning now seemed like a natural extension of her abilities. But, more than the equipment, her entire mindset had shifted. She no longer approached these challenges wondering if she belonged, she approached them knowing she was capable of succeeding. "Any final questions?" Torres asked. Sarah studied the building one more time, noting the multiple entry points and the movement she could detect through the windows. "The scenario brief?" 5 hostiles, unknown number of civilians, multi-level engagement, Chen replied. "The building is wired with sensors that will track your progress and record every shot. Miss a hostile, and they'll know. Hit a civilian, and they'll know that too." The implications of his words weren't lost on Sarah. This wasn't just about demonstrating competence, this was about proving she could handle the kind of complex, high-stakes situations that special operations personnel faced regularly. "Time limit?" she asked. Davidson shook his head. "No artificial time constraints. But, remember, in real situations, every second matters. The longer an operation takes, the more opportunities there are for things to go wrong." Sarah nodded and approached the building. As she reached the entrance, she heard Davidson's voice one final time, "Trust your instincts, Martinez. They've gotten you this far. The front door was slightly ajar, and Sarah could hear voices from somewhere deeper inside the building. Unlike the previous scenarios, these voices seemed more realistic, recorded audio that created an authentic atmosphere of tension and danger. She pushed through the door and immediately found herself in a lobby area with stairs leading to an upper level and hallways branching in multiple directions. The complexity was immediately apparent. This wasn't a single-room scenario where she could assess all threats from one position. She would need to systematically clear each area while remaining aware of potential threats from every direction. Sarah moved cautiously toward the nearest hallway, her weapon ready but not raised in a way that would telegraph her position. The voices seemed to be coming from the upper level, but she knew from her earlier training that assumptions could be deadly. She needed to clear each area methodically. The first room she encountered was empty, but set up to look like an office space with desks and equipment scattered around. Sarah quickly scanned for threats before moving on, maintaining awareness of the room's exit points in case she needed to retreat quickly. The second room contained her first real challenge, a civilian mannequin positioned near a window, with an armed target partially concealed behind office furniture. The angle was difficult, requiring her to position herself precisely to avoid any possibility of hitting the innocent while still neutralizing the threat. Sarah took her time, remembering Davidson's earlier words about patience versus urgency. She found a position that gave her a clean shot and took it. The target dropped immediately, but she quickly realized that the gunshot had alerted other hostiles in the building. She could hear movement and agitated voices from both the upper level and other rooms on the ground floor. This was the moment where everything she had learned that day came together. In traditional training, each shot was isolated, disconnected from larger consequences. Here, every action affected the entire scenario. She needed to think like a tactician rather than just a marksman. Sarah moved toward the stairwell, but paused when she detected movement in a room she hadn't yet cleared. The smart move was to secure her flanks before advancing to the upper level, even though the delay might give the remaining hostiles time to reposition. The next room contained a more complex scene, 2 hostiles and what appeared to be 2 civilians, but positioned in a way that made individual shots extremely difficult. Sarah studied the situation, looking for any advantage she could create. She noticed that one of the hostiles was positioned near a light switch. If she could eliminate the lights, it might disrupt their positioning enough to create better shooting angles. Sarah carefully aimed at the light fixture and fired. The room plunged into semi-darkness, and, in the confusion that followed, the targets shifted positions exactly as she had hoped. Sarah quickly engaged both hostiles in rapid succession, her improved confidence allowing her to take shots she would never have attempted that morning. 2 more threats eliminated, but she could still hear voices from the upper level. Sarah made her way to the stairwell, aware that ascending stairs created tactical disadvantages. She would be exposed and limited in her movement options. As she climbed the stairs, Sarah heard a sound that made her freeze, a door opening behind her. One of the hostiles had been positioned to cut off her retreat route. She was now potentially trapped between threats above and below. Instead of panicking, Sarah found herself thinking clearly about her options. She could retreat down the stairs and engage the threat behind her, but that would leave the hostiles above free to reposition. She could continue upward and hope to deal with the upper level quickly before the lower threat became a problem. Or she could find a third option. Sarah noticed that the stairwell had a landing with a window overlooking part of the lower level. If she could get an angle from the window, she might be able to neutralize the threat below without abandoning her position. She moved to the window and carefully assessed the situation below. The hostile was moving through the hallway, clearly searching for her. Sarah waited until he moved into a position where she had a clear shot, then engaged. The threat dropped, but the gunshot had definitely alerted everyone remaining in the building. Sarah could hear rapid movement from the upper level. The final hostiles were either preparing to ambush her or attempting to escape. Sarah reached the second floor and found herself in a more open area with multiple rooms branching off a central space. This was where the scenario became truly challenging. She needed to clear multiple potential hiding spots while remaining aware that threats could emerge from any direction. The first room was empty, but as she moved toward the second, Sarah heard a sound that made her blood run cold, what sounded like a civilian in distress. The audio was sophisticated enough that she couldn't immediately tell if it was coming from a recording or if there was actually a mannequin positioned to suggest someone in danger. Sarah approached the source of the sound and discovered the most complex situation yet, a hostile holding what appeared to be a civilian hostage, positioned so that any direct shot would risk hitting the innocent person. The scenario was designed to test not just her marksmanship, but her ability to think creatively under extreme pressure. She studied the situation from multiple angles, looking for any opportunity to resolve it safely. The hostel's position was excellent from a defensive standpoint, but Sarah noticed that the positioning also limited the target's field of vision. If she could approach from an unexpected angle, she might be able to surprise the threat. Sarah made her way around to a different room that she hoped would provide a better vantage point. Through a connecting doorway, she could see into the hostage situation from the side. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was workable. She lined up her shot, controlling her breathing and focusing on the precision that months of training had developed. This was the moment that would define not just the exercise, but her confidence in her own abilities. Sarah took the shot. The hostile dropped immediately, and the civilian remained unharmed. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction that was unlike anything she had experienced in traditional training. She had solved a complex problem under pressure, using not just marksmanship but tactical thinking and creative problem-solving. But the exercise wasn't over. Sarah could still hear movement from somewhere on the upper level. At least one more threat remained. She systematically cleared the remaining rooms, finding the final hostile in what appeared to be a simulated office space. This target was positioned defensively, clearly aware that Sarah was approaching. Unlike the previous encounters, this was a straight tactical engagement with no civilians to complicate the situation. The hostile was well positioned behind cover, making a direct approach dangerous. Sarah studied the room layout, looking for advantages she could create. She noticed that the target's position, while defensively strong, also limited his mobility. If she could force him to reposition, she might create an opportunity. Sarah fired a shot that deliberately missed, striking the wall near the hostile's cover. As she had hoped, the target shifted position, and, in that moment of movement, she took her shot. The final threat dropped, and silence settled over the building. Sarah remained alert for several more minutes, ensuring that she hadn't missed any threats. Only when she was confident that the building was clear did she lower her weapon and key her radio. "Building secure," she reported, though her voice was hoarse with adrenaline and concentration. "Outstanding work, Martinez," Davidson's voice came through her earpiece. "Come on down. Let's talk about what just happened." As Sarah made her way out of the building, she realized that everything had changed. The woman who had entered that structure 20 minutes ago had been someone trying to prove herself worthy. The woman leaving was someone who knew exactly what she was capable of accomplishing. Davidson, Torres, and Chen were waiting outside, but their expressions were different from earlier in the day. There was no more professional assessment or patient instruction. They were looking at her with the respect accorded to a peer. "How do you feel?" Davidson asked. Sarah thought about the question, trying to process everything that had happened. "Different," she said finally. "Like I've been shooting with one hand tied behind my back for months." Torres laughed. "That's because you have been. Not physically, but mentally. You've been so focused on meeting minimum standards that you never explored your maximum potential." "The equipment made a difference," Sarah admitted. "Some," Chen agreed. "But equipment doesn't think, doesn't make tactical decisions, doesn't create solutions to complex problems. That was all you." Davidson stepped forward, and Sarah noticed he was carrying something, a different rifle, sleek and, obviously high-end. "This is for you," he said, offering her the weapon. Sarah stared at the rifle, hardly believing what she was seeing. "I don't understand." "Consider it on permanent loan," Davidson explained. "You've proven today that you're capable of operating at a level that deserves the best equipment available. More importantly, you've proven that you think like an operator, not just a marksman." Sarah accepted the rifle, feeling its perfect balance and understanding that this was more than just equipment, it was recognition of something fundamental that had changed about her capabilities and her confidence. "What happens now?" she asked. Davidson smiled. "Now you go back to your regular training and show them what Sarah Martinez is really capable of. And, when you're ready for the next level, you know where to find us." As Sarah walked back toward the main training areas, carrying the new rifle and feeling the weight of what had transpired, she realized that this day had been about more than just shooting. It had been about discovering who she was when she stopped limiting herself and started believing in her potential. Tomorrow, she would return to the regular firing line, but everything would be different. She would no longer be shooting to avoid failure. she would be shooting to excel, knowing that excellence was not just possible but inevitable. Sarah stood at the familiar firing line the next morning, but everything had changed. The rifle in her hands was the one Davidson had given her the day before, a precision instrument that felt alive with possibilities. Around her, the same trainees went through their familiar routines, but Sarah was no longer one of them. Something fundamental had shifted during those hours with the SEALs. Sergeant Williams approached, his expression curious as he noticed the new weapon. "Martinez, where did you get that rifle?" "Special training, Sergeant," Sarah replied, meeting his eyes with a confidence that surprised them both. "Chief Davidson arranged some additional instruction." Williams' eyebrows rose. Elite Special Operations personnel didn't typically take interest in struggling trainees, and his expression suggested he wasn't sure what to make of the situation. "Well," he said after a moment, "let's see what this special training accomplished." "Standard drill, 200 meters." Sarah nodded and moved into position. As she settled into her stance, she became aware that other trainees had stopped their own exercises to watch. Word had apparently spread about her time with the SEALs, and everyone was curious to see if the experience had made any real difference. Marcus Wilson stood a few yards away, his usual cocky confidence replaced by genuine curiosity. "So Martinez," he called out, "did the professionals teach you anything useful?" Sarah looked through her scope at the distant target, remembering Davidson's words about shooting to excel rather than shooting to avoid failure. "I guess we'll find out," she replied. She fired. The shot struck dead center, better than any shot she had ever fired on this range. But, more importantly, it felt different. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, no careful calculation designed to achieve adequate results. She had simply seen the target, trusted her abilities, and executed. "Outstanding shot, Martinez," Sergeant Williams said, and, for the first time since arriving at the program, his praise sounded genuine rather than encouraging. Sarah fired 4 more rounds, each one finding the center of the target with precision that drew increasingly impressed murmurs from the other trainees. When she finally lowered her weapon, the silence around her was profound. "Well," Wilson said quietly, "I guess they did teach you something." Over the next several weeks, Sarah's transformation became the talk of the training program. Her scores improved dramatically, but, more than that, her entire approach had changed. She no longer shot with the careful defensiveness of someone trying to avoid failure. Instead, she attacked each challenge with the confidence of someone who expected to succeed. The change didn't go unnoticed by the instructors. Sergeant Williams began using her as an example during technical instruction, and other trainees started asking for her advice on challenging shots. Sarah found herself in the unfamiliar position of being sought out rather than ignored. But the real test came 6 weeks later, when the training program held its final qualification exercise, a complex scenario designed to test everything the trainees had learned during their months of instruction. Sarah approached the challenge with calm focus, carrying the rifle Davidson had given her and the confidence he had helped her discover. The qualification course was more demanding than anything they had faced before, with multiple targets at varying distances, time pressure, and environmental challenges designed to stress even the most prepared shooters. Sarah moved through the course methodically, each shot deliberate but confident. When the scores were announced, Sarah Martinez had not only passed the qualification, she had achieved the highest score in the program's recent history. The woman who had arrived months earlier hoping simply to survive the training had graduated as the top performer in her class. At the graduation ceremony, Sarah stood with her fellow trainees as Sergeant Williams addressed the assembled group. Her parents had flown in for the occasion, and she could see the pride and amazement in their faces. 6 months ago, they had worried about whether she would be able to complete the program. Now they were watching her receive recognition as the most outstanding graduate. "This class has shown exceptional dedication and skill," Williams said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "But one trainee in particular has demonstrated what's possible when natural ability combines with unwavering determination to excel." Sarah felt her cheeks warm as Williams continued. "Martinez, front and center." As Sarah stepped forward, she caught sight of 3 familiar figures at the back of the crowd. Davidson, Torres, and Chen had come to watch her graduation, their presence a reminder of the day that had changed everything. Davidson caught her eye and nodded slightly, a small gesture that conveyed volumes of approval and pride. "For achieving the highest qualification score in program history," Williams announced, "and for exemplifying the kind of excellence we strive to develop, Martinez receives the Distinguished Graduate Award." The applause was thunderous, but Sarah barely heard it. She was thinking about the young woman who had stood on this same range 6 weeks ago, convinced that she was destined for mediocrity. That woman had been shooting not to fail, limiting herself to safe, adequate performance because she didn't believe she deserved more. After the ceremony, as Sarah mingled with family and fellow graduates, Davidson approached her. "Congratulations," he said simply. "Though I can't say I'm surprised." "Thank you, Chief," Sarah replied. "For everything. I don't think I would have made it through without that day of training." Davidson shook his head. "You had everything you needed already. We just helped you stop getting in your own way." He paused, studying her with the same assessing look she remembered from their first meeting. "I have a question for you, Martinez. Are you ready for the next challenge?" Sarah's heart began to race. "What kind of challenge?" "The kind where shooting is just the beginning," Davidson said. "Special operations training. If you're interested." The offer hung in the air between them, massive with implications and possibilities. 6 months ago, Sarah would never have imagined herself worthy of consideration for such an opportunity. Now, she found herself evaluating the challenge with the same confidence that had transformed her marksmanship. "What would it involve?" she asked. "Everything you've learned here, and about 10 times more," Torres said, appearing beside Davidson. "Physical challenges that will push you beyond anything you've experienced. Mental pressure that will test every aspect of your character. Technical skills that require perfection rather than adequacy." Chen joined them as well, completing the trio that had become so important to Sarah's development. "Fair warning," he added. "Special operations training has a dropout rate of about 60%. It's designed to find your limits and, then, push you past them." Sarah looked at the 3 men who had helped her discover what she was capable of accomplishing. 6 weeks ago, their offer would have terrified her. Now, it excited her. "When do I start?" she asked. Davidson smiled broadly. "That's the Sarah Martinez we knew was in there somewhere. Report to Building 47 next Monday at 0500. "And, Martinez?" He paused until she met his eyes. "Bring that confidence with you. You're going to need it." As the graduation celebration continued around them, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Months ago, she had been someone who shot to avoid failure, someone who believed that adequate was the best she could hope for. Now she was someone who shot to excel, someone who understood that her potential was limited only by her own willingness to pursue it. The rifle Davidson had given her hung at her side, a constant reminder of the day everything changed. But the real transformation hadn't been in her equipment or even her technical skills. The real change had been in her understanding of what was possible when she stopped limiting herself and started believing she deserved to succeed. Later that evening, as Sarah packed her belongings in preparation for the next phase of her training, she found herself thinking about other young women who might be struggling with the same doubts she had once carried. She thought about the importance of having someone believe in your potential, even when you couldn't see it yourself. She pulled out a piece of paper and began to write a letter. "To whoever finds this," she began, "if you're reading this, you're probably wondering if you're good enough to be here. I want you to know that I stood exactly where you're standing, asking exactly the same questions. I want you to know that the answer is yes, you are good enough. You're more than good enough. You just need to stop shooting to avoid failure and start shooting to succeed." Sarah sealed the letter and left it in the barracks where the next group of trainees would find it. Someone would need to hear those words, just as she had needed to hear them from Davidson. The next morning, Sarah reported to Building 47 at 0500, carrying her precision rifle and the confidence that had transformed her from someone who hoped to survive training into someone who expected to excel at whatever challenges lay ahead. As she approached the building, Sarah saw Davidson waiting for her, along with several other instructors she didn't recognize. Behind them stood a group of trainees, both men and women, who would be starting special operations training alongside her. "Ready, Martinez?" Davidson asked. Sarah thought about the question, remembering the young woman who had stood at a firing line 6 weeks ago, convinced that mediocrity was the best she could hope for. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that excellence wasn't a gift reserved for others, it was a choice available to anyone willing to stop limiting themselves. "Ready, Chief," she replied, and knew with absolute certainty that she was. The next phase of her journey was about to begin, but Sarah Martinez was no longer someone who approached challenges wondering if she belonged. She was someone who approached them knowing that she would find a way to succeed, because success was what she had trained for, prepared for, and earned the right to expect. As they walked toward the training facility together, Davidson's words from that first day echoed in her mind. Tomorrow, we find out what you're really made of. Now Sarah knew the answer to that question, and it was better than she had ever dared to imagine.